It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Trevor Hancock to you. First of all, let me say it's great to see so many people from so many different areas across Nova Scotia, from universities and education and advocacy groups, health, wellness. It's great to see people come together around our common goal. So thank you so much for coming today. As Minister Levine said earlier, the important work of the Thrive strategy can only be enhanced by a multitude of Nova Scotians all working toward our common goal. I believe you will find the idea reflected by our first keynote speaker, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you. Trevor and I go back some time ago, almost 20 years, so it's a great pleasure to introduce Trevor to you today. Dr. Trevor Hancock is a professor and senior scholar in the Public Health and Social Policy Department at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. He is also a public health physician and health promotion consultant, one of the founders of the Healthy Cities and Community movement, a board member of the Child and Nature Alliance, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Arts and the Health Network Canada. We owe Dr. Hancock a great credit for the first use of the term healthy public policy, which is the heart of our Thrive strategy here today. Over the past 30 years, he has worked as a consultant for local communities, municipal, provincial, and national governments, healthcare organizations, NGOs, and the World Health Organization. I would be standing here talking far too long if I tried to list only a fraction of his many accomplishments and things that he's worked on. And so I will turn the stage over to Trevor and to share with you this presentation on working together to create healthier communities. I'd like you to welcome with me Dr. Trevor Hancock.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've had various connections with Nova Scotia, one of which goes back a very long way. I was reminiscing with somebody yesterday that when I started in Canada, it was in early 1975, and I worked in rural New Brunswick in Chipman as a family physician. And my wife and I once drove to Halifax just so we could get a curry. We also had a wonderful weekend, I recall, driving around Cape Breton. And I've got many other contacts, and in particular, colleagues and friends here, and I'm working with folks on food security here and so on. So what I'm here to do today is to take us perhaps a step even further higher and deeper and back than we've been. And I've got this title that is up in front of you. It takes a hael community to raise healthy people. You may wonder what the hael I'm going to be talking about. That's the only groaner in my presentation, so. But I'm going to explain all of that. But before I do that, I just want to comment on a couple of things I heard today that I thought were really that I thought were very positive and encouraging. So, ooh, that's interesting. I just totally lost my, there it is. So the minister's message in the document we have in front of us, the Thrive report, it makes the point we need to change the environments where we live, learn, work, play, and commute. And a lot of the stories and examples that were in the gallery there were about that. And I found that was a very interesting time I had wandering around there. Didn't get to everything, but I got to quite a lot of stuff. But today he also said, we need to change our physical, social, and cultural environments. And I like the introduction of the term cultural environments there, because what we're really talking about fundamentally is a shift in our whole culture, in the way we live our lives and how that frames the way we live our lives. And he also said we need to think differently and live differently. And in fact, those are not minor changes in thinking differently and living differently. They're very profound changes. I'll probably come back to this, but I just started reading Naomi Klein's new book, This Changes Everything, which is about climate change and our economic system. And it's looking at and talking about some very profound changes, some of which I will touch on as we go along. Also in the report, the Scientific Advisory Council said that what this was about was an upstream whole-of-government population health approach to chronic disease prevention. And it's a good model of doing that, and something that we've also done in BC. I spent 9 years working at the Ministry of Health as a consultant before I moved to the university. So we were developing very similar sorts of projects and worked with Rob Strang on some of that over the years. So I want to take all of that and go broader and deeper. And for one thing, I want to maybe raise our focus a little from chronic disease. We need to be thinking about chronic disease in a broader context, both in terms of what is a chronic disease. So, for example, we don't usually consider mental health disorders, but many of those are chronic diseases and need to be in the hopper when we think about that, particularly because, and again, we don't give it enough emphasis, but physical and mental health are tightly coupled. It's not as if our mind is over here and our body's over there and they don't talk to each other. And they interact in all sorts of ways, and you well know that. And so we need to think about, what are the mental health benefits of being in a garden, for example. It's not just about digging the ground and growing healthy food. And then there are chronic sequelae of injury. So we think of injury as an acute event, but the results of that injury can be lifelong and devastating in some cases. And so that's really also part of the chronic conditions if we move beyond thinking about chronic disease. And then finally, in fact, of course, we talk about, and WHO kind of introduced this, that when they talked about non-communicable diseases, meaning chronic diseases, but some communicable diseases are chronic. HIV, obviously, Hep C, TB, things like that, multi-year, if not lifelong conditions. The second thing is that it's more than chronic disease prevention. And I draw your attention in the report to the statement of the vision and for Thrive. And the vision starts in a fairly standard way and says it's about eating healthily and being physically active. But then it goes on and says that the second part of the vision statement is that Nova Scotia is the easiest place in Canada for children to grow up healthy. Well, think about that for a minute. What does that mean? That is not just about physical activity and healthy eating. What does it take for kids to grow up healthy? Healthy families, healthy parents, healthy communities, literacy, education, safe streets, on and on and on, adequate income, you name it. Everything we do in society affects whether or not kids can grow up healthy. So that's a pretty ambitious program. And so when you talk about Thrive, and you can also see that, I knew I'd forget to do that, but if you read on page 7, I was going to bring it up here, the Social Policy Foundation statement. That is, again, huge. It talks about, yes, thank you. Perfect. So I'll just read it to you to save you digging around for it. Thrive, governments at all levels need to continue to implement and expand policies that provide a living wage. I actually don't know of many government documents yet that have talked about a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage. That's pretty powerful and very important. Affordable housing, access to quality childcare, income and employment supports, employment standards and arrangements, affordable transportation, a good public education system, it's all there. So we're talking about everything we do that enables children. Whoops, interesting. That's what happens when you wave your hands around a lot. Everything we do that makes it possible for children to grow up healthy. And so it's in that context, and actually in the context of the Thrive document, that I'm going to be talking. So now if I haven't fused the clicker with the water. Oh, perfect. Okay. So, what the hael am I talking about? Well, Hael is a root word. It's an Old English word. Sometimes as hael, an Old Norse or Old German word. It all has essentially the same roots. And it means these things that you see on the screen. We talk about being hale and hearty. We actually talk about that. H-A-L-E is the way we spell it. Heal, health, holy. That's really interesting, that the word health and the word holy have the same word root. And even something I'm very keen on, and that is wassail or wassail. I'm a Morris dancer. I'll probably talk about that more, because one of the things, I don't know, was anybody in any of the presentations talking about dancing, just out of interest? Not one of you. I'm deeply shocked, profoundly disappointed, not at all surprised. Sorry? Oh, good, excellent. Everyone go talk to that person afterwards, okay? But seriously, actually, that dancing as a form of physical activity, it's not about sport, all about sport. It's not all about recreation. It's also, incidentally, about dog walking. Most of the best friends we've made in Victoria, we've actually met walking our dogs. That's how we got to know people when we arrived in Victoria. And those are the lasting friendships we've made in many cases. So there's all sorts of physical, social, mental benefits from some of these less conventional forms of physical activity. And wassail, sorry, I was getting about wassail. So in Morris, we in the winter do a mummers play and we go to wassails. And a wassail is an Old English tradition for blessing the apple orchard. We were talking about apples earlier. And you go and bless the apple orchard and then you drink some cider, which helps. At least it helps us, not the orchard. Anyway, so there's lots of roots to this. It's a very profound word, in fact, hael. So if we start to apply that to thrive as a plan for a healthier Nova Scotia, when we talk about it being healthier, we're really talking about it being more whole, which is, of course, where that broad understanding and definition in your social policy foundation begins to kick in. We sometimes talk about looking at the whole person. We talk about how doctors should look at the whole person, not the different bits. It's not just their heart or their mind or their smoking. It's all of that and more. It's their social and environmental living and working conditions. We also talk about an holistic approach, and actually holos comes from a Greek root, not in fact from the word hail, but it means systems relating to or concerned with complete systems rather than individual parts. I'd rather be seen as a complete system than a bunch of individual parts, personally. And so when we talk about our health system, for starters, we usually end up talking about our healthcare system when we really mean, or we should be meaning, something different. So there's a healthcare system and there's a health system. And if you think about a set of nested systems, which is what a holistic approach is all about, or an ecological approach for that matter, you can start with atoms, and you can move from atoms up to the organs. And all of that is pretty much the domain of clinical medicine. That's what clinical medicine tends to look at. Then you come over to the other side. Now we're talking about not a health care system, or actually, to be more honest, an illness care system, which is mostly what it is. And that's not a put down. When I'm ill, I want a good illness care system. But it's not a health system. It doesn't generate health. What generates health is family and community and city and nation, and I could add in there culture and the planet as a whole. And so we need to understand a holistic approach as spanning everything from atoms to the planet. And that's the business, particularly, that we in population and public health and all of our allies and partners are in or should be in, and that's how we need to be thinking. So the business that I'm in, the vision that I have, is of healthy people in healthy communities, in healthy, I guess I should have put in there, in healthy provinces, in healthy nations, in a healthy world. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. That's my vision. That's the business I'm in. A word about vision, because you use the word vision in your document. I just used the word vision. My friend Clem Beasold said that vision is values projected into the future. And I think that's such an interesting and powerful way to think about what a vision is. Incidentally, to save you taking photos of every slide, it's going to be available. PowerPoint's going to be available. So vision is values projected into the future. So what are your values? So when we think about the future we want or we prefer, we're expressing our values implicitly, if not explicitly. So these are some of my values. They may not be your values. They may not be society's values, but they're my values. People. I put people first. Trained in medicine, I have a people focus. I'm anthropocentric, as the academics would say. Social justice and equity. Ecological sustainability, because, and I'll come back to that, but obviously ultimately we live on a single planet. We have to act sustainably within that planet. And then personal and community empowerment, that people need to be engaged, need to be empowered, or it's not that we can empower them, we have to enable people to become empowered. And then finally, peace and non-violence. I don't think we solve the world's problems at the end of a barrel of a gun. So those are some of the things that I value, and I try and then enact them in population and public health work. So what business are we in? Well, if you pay attention to what governments tend to talk about, certainly higher levels of government, we're in the business of maximizing economic development, and governments talk endlessly and primarily about the economy. Well, you know, Bill Clinton in his campaign had a slogan up on his wall to keep him on message, and the slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." And my response is, well, actually the business we should be in is not maximizing economic development, but maximizing human development. Remember, I'm people-centered, I'm human-centered. And so the economy is just a means to achieve that end. And to the extent that it achieves that end, I'm in favor of it. Generally, there are some issues around that, and we'll come to that. But to the extent that it goes against that end, I'm opposed to it. So economic development that harms human development in some way, particularly the human development of the most vulnerable people, that is not the kind of economic development we should be having. So, and the United Nations said this, the human person is the central subject of development. That was the Declaration on the Right to Development from the UN General Assembly in 1986. And then we have the UN Development Programme and the UN Human Development Index and all the rest of it as better ways of measuring progress than GDP. So what should Bill Clinton have said? He should have said, "It's the people, stupid." And that's what we should be saying. It's the people. That's what this is about. That's the business we're in. We're not here to grow an economy. I don't think that's my sole purpose on earth. That's why human beings exist. Surely we're here to grow people. And that's the business we're in. And you know what? Nova Scotians get this. This is from the report of the, what's it called? Choosing Nova Scotia. That's at the basis of, what do you call it? 1NS, is that right? Yeah, okay. So people were asked what were necessary for Nova Scotia to be a place of choice for people and businesses. Again, you know, the economic angle in there. But look what they said, and as far as I know, this list was in order of priority. This is what people talked about. Quality of life, services, rich cultural, recreational learning offerings. You don't come to anything that is explicitly economic until you get into the beginning of the second column there, where you talk about economic employment opportunities, competitive wages, sustainable economy, and so on. So what people are saying, in essence, is it's the people, stupid. It's human development. It's about people and quality of life and culture and recreation and learning and all of those good things. So people get it. Not that this is not a diatribe against the economy or economic development. Far from it. Economic development is very important, as I'll come to. But it has to be the right sort of economic development, not just any old economic development that pumps dollars into the economy. If that were the case, then we'd all be in favor of tobacco, right? Huge economic opportunities. Well, we fight it hard, because it's the wrong sort of economic development. And there's many other examples. So how do we make people and nations and communities healthy? Well, you know what? It's not rocket science. It's much more complex. You want to know how complex? This is Ontario's chronic disease map. There'll be a test on this at the end. You need to know all of the links and connections. It's more complicated than that. Anybody seen this map before? This is the UK obesity system map. There's something like 125 different factors in there. There's about 10 different clusters that all interact. And this is just for obesity. Never mind everything else that we've been talking about. So actually, it's very complex to try and delve into what we're doing. There are no quick fixes. There are no simple fixes. There's no just press this button and everything will be all right, or take this drug and it'll all be fine. It's much more complex than that. So let's try and simplify it at least a bit. This comes from Murray and Lopez's article in 1999 about a chronic disease prevention model. There's some inbuilt biases here that I'll come back to, but nonetheless, it puts it into much more simple terms, and you've used some of those, and we actually use these kind of things in our logic models, if you think about it. So there's the outcomes of mortality and morbidity, or health, if you want to put it in positive terms, and then there are the physiological and pathophysiological causes, and then you have they call them the proximal causes. These are largely behavioral. This is where we often end up focusing. But then we have to go upstream, as your own Thrive strategy talks about, and address some of those distal socioeconomic, and I would add, incidentally, what's missing there is environmental causes. And I want to make an important point here, which is that lifestyle, we need to think of it, because it's a word we use a lot, and we use it in the context of behavior. But lifestyle is, in fact, a collective noun. We have a particular lifestyle in Canada. We have a particular lifestyle in Nova Scotia, a particular lifestyle in Halifax compared to, say, Antigonish, that is different. Never mind if we start looking at the lifestyle in India or China or Latin America. And so those lifestyles are not things we simply freely choose. Lifestyle is something that we all share to a fair extent. And so lifestyle is a collective noun that we shape in the way that we organize our societies and our communities. We shape the choices that are available to us. And we shape the values that we have that we apply to those choices. And so lifestyle is a collective noun. And I think that's a really important point to understand. And the next time you get into a discussion with someone about lifestyle, try and bring in this notion of it. Yeah, lifestyle is a fine term, but it's not my personal free choice. It's my choice conditioned by all of the other things that affect my choices and those of my family and my friends and my neighbors and my community. So we share a collective lifestyle, and those choices are shaped and constrained, and they're constrained by who we are and where we live and what our history is and what our culture is and all of that. But we do have to, and it was alluded to this morning, the minister referred to it, as make the healthy choice the easy choice. A lovely, simple idea from Nancy Milio 20 or 30 years ago. But you know what? We often, in fact, make the unhealthy choice the easy choice. We do it time and again. It's easier to take the car than to walk. It's easier, and if you live in some of those suburbs, there's nowhere to walk to. You can't get there by walking. It's easier to pick up fast food than cook it yourself, and on and on and on, all sorts of ways. Then we get all exercised about why are people making these unhealthy choices? Why don't they make healthy choices? Well, they don't make healthy choices in part because we've made those healthy choices more difficult than the unhealthy alternative. And so we really shouldn't be too puzzled by people making unhealthy choices, both individually and collectively. So car-oriented environments, happy hour. Okay, how many people here can resist the concept of happy hour? Not one of us. One of us. There we are. Okay, good, good. But you know, it's nuts. when we know that moderation in drinking and not drinking and driving and all the rest of it, why would we have a policy that allows happy hour? That's really, frankly, stupid. And we should stop it. Not that I have strong opinions on it or anything. And of course, all the marketing of all the unhealthy products that goes on and so on. So we shouldn't be surprised if people make unhealthy choices. And what we need to do is both work with them on their ability to, if you like, resist, to give them more resilience and more knowledge and understanding to resist the unhealthy choice. But they're still probably going to make it unless we change the options that they're facing. So let's look upstream. Let's look at that phrase in that model about distal socioeconomic causes, which is really the social determinants of health. Things like, and the three things they mention there are income, education, and social capital. So I'm going to touch a bit on some of those as we go along. So income, you know, in our society, it buys the necessities of life, starting with clean water. One reason that we have the level of health we have is that as a society we are wealthy enough to afford in water treatment systems and sewage treatment systems. That takes some money. There's a good use of economic development because we're able to buy that. Similarly, we're able to buy universal education, which is a great thing. And those two things alone, clean water and education, add to that healthy food, are three of the great drivers of good health. And it's because we have a level of economic development that allows those. So yes, you need a certain level of economic development to achieve that. And education has to be much more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. It also has to be the knowledge and skills for life and family and work. I think it's actually kind of strange that you have to get a license to drive a car but not to be a parent. Not that I'm recommending licensing parents exactly, but where are our priorities? You know, it's one of the most important things you do if you have kids is to raise kids. And we really don't do a good job of preparing people for that and supporting them through it. And then social capital, and I'll come to that. Whoops, too many gadgets up here. So let me talk about social capital, because I think the other two are fairly common. Because I think there's too narrow an understanding of social capital. And our understanding of social capital is about how we interact with each other. And there's a very important distinction, incidentally, between that and human capital, which we don't often make. So human capital is about what resides in me and what resides in us collectively if you amass our individual human capital. So my level of health, my level of education, my capacity for innovation and creativity, my ability to be empathetic and caring, whatever it may be that you consider part of human capital, it actually resides in me. And if we took everybody's knowledge in the room and pooled it, that would be our shared human capital. But that's different from social capital. Social capital is about the connections between us. And all the early work on social capital was on what I would call informal social capital. And it came out of Putnam's work to some extent. He was a key starter of this. And it's about informal networks and linkages in communities and between organizations and people and so on. And it's very important. So it's networks and linkages of friends and associates. But there's two other forms of social capital that I think we have neglected and we need to pay some attention to if we want to build healthy communities. One is what I call formal social capital. We're familiar with the idea of our built infrastructure, our bridges and roads and all the rest of it, and we think that's very important. But we have invested billions and billions of dollars in social infrastructure, in education, healthcare, social services, recreation, libraries, on and on and on. And some of that is bricks and mortar, but a lot of it is the program and that goes with it. And that is a shared form of social capital. It's how we have agreed in a very formal way to share the burden of illness, or the cost of illness, rather, amongst us, or to share the cost of education amongst us. And just because you don't have kids, and I don't have kids, doesn't mean that I don't pay school tax. Of course I pay school tax, and I think it's very important that I should pay school tax. Or if I'm a parent whose kids have grown up, I should still pay school tax. or a grandparent or whatever. So we've agreed to do that. That's what I would call formal social capital. It's a formal social contract amongst us. And then the third form is what I call invisible social capital. But we have spent centuries, literally centuries, creating legal and political and constitutional systems that structure the way we relate to each other. And we never think of that. We never think of Parliament or the courts or the Canadian Constitution as part of our social capital, but it actually is. And so democracy and democratic systems and processes are very much a form of social capital, and we need to invest in those, and we need to think about their health implications too, because all of these have health implications. So, not quite a diversion, but a broadening and deepening of that. The second thing, and the thing that was missing from the model, the Marian Lopez model, is physical environments. It's often overlooked, and I find this really shocking. I have my students in one of my courses do an exercise where they keep a time diary for a week, and they have to see, or they have to write down where they spent time and how, and then reflect on how healthy those environments were. And they're always shocked when they find that they spent 90% or so of their time indoors. We all think we're outdoors people. We actually spend, in North America, 90% of our time indoors. We're also 80% urbanized. So even when you step outdoors, you're stepping outdoors into a built environment most of the time, 80% of the time. So those are our physical determinants of health, the built environment, both of our homes and of our communities. But then the other thing is we also live 100% of the time within natural ecosystems on a single planet. And so those are the three things that really have huge impacts on our health and that we have not in public health really paid enough attention to. We did around housing in the early years. If you go back and look at building codes and things like that, they're actually coming out of public health concerns. That's why we established building codes in the first place, so buildings would be safe and healthy. We're now paying a lot more attention to urban design and have done in the last decade or two, a healthy transportation and all of that. We haven't paid enough attention yet to the ecological determinants of health, and I'll come to that. So I'll come to that next. So it's not only is it's not the economy stupid, we should be also saying it's not just the people stupid, it's the environment stupid. And that's both a physical and a social environment, but particularly right now, the physical environment. So I'll come back to the built environment part of it. I just want to talk a little bit about this because some of you may know I'm currently leading a Canadian Public Health Association process to develop a report and a policy position on the ecological determinants of health. So we're very accustomed to thinking about the social determinants of health, but in that process, we've actually neglected the ecological determinants of health, and we're now trying to say, well, it's both. And in fact, they interact hugely, and we need to be paying attention to that. So the fundamental determinants of our health are air and water and soil. You know, it's really hard to live without air, water, soil, and food. So those are pretty fundamental determinants of health. And then what we're actually doing, if you look at it, and Naomi, I keep calling her Nancy Klein for some reason. Naomi Klein, her book is about the first of those, climate and atmospheric change. But not only are we changing the atmosphere and changing the climate, we're also depleting resources, particularly particularly so-called renewable resources such as farmland and fisheries and water and forests and so on at unsustainable rates. We've created a world in which every single one of us and every single one of our kids carries a body burden of persistent organic pollutants. That's pretty stupid when you stop to think about it, that we would do that. It makes us, in effect, unwilling participants in an unauthorized experiment to find out what happens when you expose an entire population to lifelong, over their lifetime, to persistent organic pollutants. We actually don't know what the health implications of that are. We may well not easily find that out, if at all. But it's a huge challenge, huge issue. And more to the point, I didn't agree, I didn't consent to be part of this experiment, but I am part of it, so are you. And then we have loss of species. We're facing, not just facing, we're at the beginning of what some have called the sixth great extinction. The other five were caused largely by asteroids crashing into the Earth and so on. This one we're causing. All of these have huge, profound public health implications. And what we're doing is we're crossing some what are called safe operating boundaries. And these are 9 Earth systems. And of those 9, we've already crossed the boundary for 3, and we're approaching the boundary for 3 others in terms of what's believed to be sustainable and compatible with not necessarily life on Earth, but certainly with human societies and civilizations. So we're at a very dangerous point in terms of the ecological determinants of health, not just climate change, but all those others, and especially because all those others, they all interact with each other, usually negatively, not always, but usually. And so you'll find in my presentation, when you get it, a series of 7 slides or 6 slides here that I've hidden because I just don't have time to go into the detail, but they're there as a resource. But here's putting it in a nutshell. On the left there, you have the world's biocapacity, which is that green line trending downward because partly we have more and more people on Earth, and then our ecological footprint. And you'll see that our ecological footprint exceeds our biocapacity and has done since about the 1970s as a planet. Currently, we need about 1.4 planets based on the ecological footprint. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's actually not another planet out there. We've got this one, and we have to learn to live within its limits, and we're not doing that. So when I talk about profound change, and when Naomi Klein talks about profound change in her book, this is what we're talking about. This cannot go on. It simply can't go on. And you bring that back then to what are the health implications of that, particularly if the transition becomes a nasty transition because systems start to fail. A lot of people are going to get hurt. A lot of people are going to die. This has huge public health implications, and we cannot ignore it or hope it'll go away. It certainly won't go away. And then one more thing. Well, there's a whole lot more things, actually, but this is just one of those. Equity, okay? You probably are familiar with, many of you, the discussions about the difference between disparity, inequality, and inequity. Governments tend to prefer the term disparity. It's seen as more neutral somehow, just an observation. Oh, look, there's a difference. Sometimes the word inequality will creep in. But inequity is something different. Inequity is considered to be unfair, unjust, avoidable, preventable differences. So there are differences because I'm male and you're female. Those are largely considered to be put it this way, on a sex basis, on a biological basis, those are largely considered to be just the way life is. There are some diseases I get that a woman can't get and vice versa, and that's just the way it is. Gender-based differences, which is a sociological phenomenon, that's different. And those are unjust very often, and they are potentially or should be avoidable and preventable. So I just want to raise that. What we're talking about here is inequity. That is to say, unfair, unjust, avoidable, preventable inequalities. Carl Darcy, in writing a report for Health and Welfare Canada, as it was then back in 1988, said that inequalities can be observed, but inequity demands action. And so, as we think about all of these things, all of the things I've talked about thus far, all of them are stratified, distributed across the population, largely on the basis of income or of socioeconomic status. And so guess who has the least choice? Guess who has the most absence of healthy food? Guess who is most threatened by climate change, and on and on. We know who that's going to be. It's going to be the disadvantaged in our country, and it's going to be the disadvantaged in other countries and around the world. How many people here have come across a book called The Spirit Level? Okay. Richard Wilkinson and Nancy Pickett. Richard Wilkinson is a noted social epidemiologist. He wrote a book called The Spirit Level with Nancy Pickett. This is the book in a nutshell, and I'm grateful to him for his slides. As inequality, income inequality becomes greater, problems become worse. It's quite simple, but what he's talking about is at a national level. So if we look at life expectancy by income from 0 to about $10,000 per capita, it makes a big difference. Remember I said you have to have economic development so you can afford to buy clean water, sewers, public education, all of that. But once you get past certainly about $20,000 per capita, which is kind of where this is, there's actually very little relationship between, in this case, life expectancy and income. These are high-income countries. All of them have above $20,000 per capita. Canada's kind of in the middle there. There's no obvious relationship between income per se, income per capita, or GDP per capita, and life expectancy. But and then if you take a whole bunch of other factors, and they created in their book an index with about 10 of these different factors: mental illness, teenage births, trust, infant mortality, a whole bunch of different factors, and plot that index against health problems, against income rather. Again, no real relationship. When you plot it against level of income inequality, look at that. So income inequality is a huge problem. And, no, that's interesting. Oh, thank you. And the higher your level of income inequality, and Canada's about in the middle of that pack, the worse your health and social problems. As the WHO Commission said, social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. That is very obviously a public health issue. So, I'm going to flick on a little bit here and just talk about one of the key recommendations from WHO, from that Commission on Social Determinants of Health, that we need to improve. One of their key recommendations is to improve daily living conditions. That's what you talk about in your Thrive strategy, in fact. The circumstances, they said, in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. Sounds familiar? Thrive. You have to also, though, they said, and this gets much more interesting and much more controversial, tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources. Ever heard of the 1%? And what that's all about? That's what that's all about. Measure and understand the problem? Yes, of course. So this is controversial stuff. So if we want to raise healthy people, we're going to need to meet basic needs, everyone's basic needs. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Create physical environments that are supportive of health, that include our buildings, our human settlements, and our natural ecosystems. And we need to create social environments that are supportive of health, that includes all forms of social capital that I talked about. And we need to do all of this equitably, and we need to do it in the settings where people lead their lives. So we talk a lot in health promotion about the settings approach. A setting is a physical place and a social space where they come together. So they're kind of nodes in our lives: home and school and workplace and hospitals and prisons and so on. And so how do we create healthy settings? So just to end up, here's some places to start. We know that the determinants of health lie well beyond healthcare, that we need to work with people who work well beyond healthcare, and a number of you in this room are here for precisely that reason. You actually, I talk about the producers of health, and the producers of health are the people who build our homes, grow our food, keep our environment clean. Those are the true producers of health, not the healthcare system. And we need to therefore create health in the settings where people lead their lives. And in doing that, we need to address basic issues of social justice, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's good for health and it's good for social well-being. You have fewer health and social problems when you have higher levels of equity within a society. That was what Wilkinson and Pickett showed. And then finally, we need to address ecological sustainability. We cannot continue to consume 1.4 planets. All of this is in the Ottawa Charter, and I'm not going to go over this. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here. But I do want to make a quick point about personal skills. So we talk about personal skills for health. In the context that I'm talking about, personal skills for health is not about, do I brush my teeth, eat the right foods, jog 30 minutes a day or whatever. Those are important. But they're also, do I have the skills to participate with other people in my community to make my community more healthy? Do I have the skills to participate in the political process and shape and influence public policy? Do I have the skills to work with others in my workplace to make it a healthier workplace? And so on, which means you have to have some basic levels of literacy and health literacy. You have to be literate not only about human biology, but about lifestyle, and then you need to be literate about the healthcare system and how it works. And finally, you need to be literate about the determinants of health. So when we talk about health literacy, we need to think about it in this much larger context. And I will leave it from there. I've got more slides, but I'm not going to cover them because I'm going to get the hook here any second now. But they're summed up here, and they're summed up in this notion. I was part of something called the Global Research Network on Urban Health Equity. And what we talked about is you need to create communities that have healthy and, I would say, sustainable physical form, urban planning. So urban planning is really important. Social conditions and social equity, ecological sustainability, and to make all that work, we need to think about and talk about and move towards governance for health. So healthy public policy, health impact assessment of non-health policies, whole of government approaches, all of those are new forms of governance, and they are forms of governance that are focused around human development, of which health is one piece. And so, if you remember nothing else, just remember, it's the people, stupid. Thank you.